I never thought I would feel such pain in my own home. That evening when my daughter-in-law, Sana, told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I smiled because what else could I do? I had already felt the first prick of betrayal, sharp and unexpected, like ice water poured over my heart. I sat there on the edge of the sofa, my hands trembling, and yet I tried to hold myself together. I tried to understand how the woman I welcomed into my family with open arms could speak those words so calmly, as if she were simply asking me to leave like a stranger in a store. Sana, my son Saad's wife, had always seemed quiet, polite, and considerate. At least that's what I thought. When Saad first introduced her to me, I felt a strange mix of happiness and relief. My son had always been a gentle soul, a man with a quiet heart, and I had prayed he would find someone who would respect him, love him, and care for him. Sana seemed to fit that mold perfectly. She smiled softly, spoke politely, and nodded at my words. I even remember thinking, maybe I was wrong to fear this. Maybe she will be the daughter-in-law I always hoped for. But that night when she asked me to leave our home, I realized just how little I truly knew her. My own son Saad, who had grown up under my care, who had hugged me when I cried and leaned on me when he was unsure, did nothing. He looked down at the floor, silent, avoiding both our eyes. I could feel the weight of his indecision. His loyalty torn between the woman he had married and the mother who had raised him. And as I sat there, heart-breaking in silence, I understood that sometimes love can be complicated, even within a family. I had not seen it coming. I had never imagined that my son's happiness could be used as a shield to hurt me. My son's wife, Sana, had slowly, subtly, and almost invisibly changed our home. At first, it was small things. Little criticisms about how I managed the kitchen, comments about my ways, the way I spoke to Saad. I thought perhaps she was just adjusting, learning, finding her place in our home. I never considered that it could be more, something deliberate, something meant to push me away. And yet, the signs had been there. The cold smiles, the dismissive glances, the quiet words said to Saad behind my back. I had chosen to ignore them, telling myself that maybe I was being too sensitive, that perhaps it was just the normal friction between a mother-in-law and a new wife. But now, as she told me to leave, the pattern became crystal clear. This was not about adjustment. This was not about a difference in opinions or ways of life. This was about me, and her desire to replace my presence, my influence, my love with herself. I remember the way she said it. "I think it's better if you don't come here unannounced anymore," she said. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet every word struck me like a blow. She didn't raise her voice. There was no shouting, no drama. And that made it worse. The calmness in her tone made the words heavier. It was as if she had rehearsed them, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to finally push me out of the life I had nurtured, the family I had loved. I tried to speak, tried to tell her that my visits were never meant to hurt her, that I only wanted to be close to my son, but the words caught in my throat. Saad looked at me, his eyes full of confusion and sorrow, but he did not intervene. I could feel him shrinking in the middle of us, caught between love for his mother and loyalty to his wife. And in that moment, I realized something I had always feared but never imagined would happen. The person I trusted most in my son's life had chosen herself over me. I sat there, nodding silently, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I wanted to cry, to scream, to tell the world how unfair this felt, but instead I smiled. I smiled because sometimes a mother has to absorb the hurt quietly. I left that evening with a heart heavy as stone, walking out the door of the home I had lived in for years, the home I had built with love. And as I closed the door behind me, I felt an emptiness I had never felt before. As I drove home that night, the rain began to fall softly on my windshield. The droplets made little rivers down the glass, blurring the world outside, and I felt a strange sense of reflection. I thought about my son, about the boy who had once held my hand and promised me he would always be by my side. I thought about Sana, the woman I had welcomed, fed, and tried to understand. And I thought about myself, sitting alone in the car, heart aching, wondering how a mother's love could be questioned, challenged, and dismissed so quietly. I never expected this betrayal. Never. And yet, as I sat in the silence of my car, listening to the rain patter against the roof, I knew that life sometimes had its cruel lessons. People change, people make choices, and sometimes the people you open your heart to the most are the ones who wound you the deepest. And the betrayal of a daughter-in-law, someone who is supposed to be a part of the family, someone you trust with your son, cuts deeper than words can describe. I drove slowly that night, thinking of the family dinners we once had, the laughter that used to fill the living room, the quiet evenings when Saad would sit next to me and talk about his day. I remembered Sanaa's smile at first, polite and gentle, and contrasted it with the coldness of that evening. And in my heart I felt a seed of fear. Fear that my son, my own son, might drift away, that the bond we had shared for so long could be eroded by the subtle, quiet actions of someone else. I arrived home that night, the house dark and silent. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the empty street. And there, in the quiet, I began to tell myself a story I would need to live through. This story would have heartbreak, yes, but also resilience. It would have pain, but also reflection. And above all, it would have truth. For in that truth, I hoped, lay the path to understanding, to reconciliation, or at the very least, to peace. Because betrayal, I realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it is soft, quiet, almost invisible. Sometimes it arrives in the form of polite words, smiles that don't reach the eyes, and doors that close a little too softly behind you. And that is the kind that leaves the deepest mark on the heart. And that is the kind I was facing now in my own home with my own daughter-in-law. I remember sitting there, in the dim light of the living room, long after Sanaa had spoken those words. My hands rested on my lap, my fingers tangled, my chest heavy with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. How could someone I welcomed into our family, someone who shared the same roof with us, someone I had laughed with, cried with, and even confided in at times, treat me like this? It felt surreal, almost like I was watching a scene from someone else's life, a story I had no part in. And yet it was my reality. The most painful part wasn't the words themselves. It was the calm, composed way she said them. There was no anger in her tone, no raised voice, no dramatics. It was almost clinical, measured. I think it's better if you don't come here unannounced anymore, she said. That simple sentence carried a weight I could barely breathe under. It was as if she had stripped me of my place in my own home with the softest possible touch. And yet, the damage was complete. I thought about Saad, my son, who sat there silently, staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped. I could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the conflict between love for his mother and loyalty to his wife. My heart ached for him too. He was a good man, a gentle soul, and I knew that he didn't want this confrontation either. But his silence, though understandable, felt like another layer of betrayal. It made me realize that sometimes children, even the ones you raise with love and care, can drift away without meaning to, pulled by the influence of someone else. I tried to find a reason, any explanation to make sense of it. Perhaps it was misunderstanding. Perhaps she had felt threatened by my presence. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It had been building quietly, subtly, over months. Small actions, little words, polite criticisms, glances that didn't reach her eyes, moments where she would speak to Saad privately and return with a smile that never reached her heart. I had ignored these signs, thinking I was being overly sensitive, imagining conflict where there was none. But now it was undeniable. That night, as I packed my bag to leave, I walked slowly through the home I had lived in for years. I ran my hand along the walls, touched the edge of the dining table where we had shared countless meals, and looked into the kitchen where so many memories were stored in the warmth of ordinary life. I felt a strange sense of loss, not for things, not for material comforts, but for a sense of belonging, a sense of home that had been quietly taken from me. I remember the exact moment I understood the depth of what had happened. As I reached the doorway, I looked back one last time. Saad was standing there, his head bowed, hands in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine. And Sanaa stood beside him, calm, composed, almost triumphant in her silence. That image, the two of them together, united in a quiet way against me, felt like a knife twisting in my heart. I realized that I had been pushed to the edge, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with quiet, calculated words that made me feel invisible in my own home. Driving home that night, I let the rain wash over the windshield, letting the soft drizzle blur the world outside. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, trying to steady myself. The tears threatened to fall, but I held them back. There was a strange clarity in my sorrow, a realization that this was no ordinary conflict. This was something deeper, a shift in my family, a subtle reordering of loyalties and affections that left me standing outside, wondering where I fit anymore. And yet, even in the midst of this heartbreak, I found a flicker of something else. A quiet, stubborn part of me refused to crumble entirely. I reminded myself of who I was, of the years I had devoted to raising my son, of the love that had formed the foundation of our home. That love could not be erased by words alone. Even if I was being pushed aside, even if my presence was questioned, I knew that my heart, my care, and my memories could not be taken from me. I thought of Saad, alone in that moment of confusion, torn between his wife and his mother. I thought of him as the little boy who used to climb into my lap, who used to seek comfort in my arms, and I wondered when the subtle divide had begun. When had the gentle cracks started forming, widening silently until they became a chasm? It was in those quiet moments of reflection that I understood something essential. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it is soft, quiet and polite. Sometimes it hides behind smiles and measured tones, and the most painful ones are those that are unseen by anyone else. And as the night grew darker and the rain continued, I realized that this was just the beginning of a journey, a painful, slow, and emotional journey that would challenge my love, my patience, and my understanding of family. It was a path that would test me in ways I had never imagined. But even in my sorrow, I felt a quiet determination rising. I would navigate this heartbreak, understand it, and find a way to either heal or accept what had happened. 'Cause that is what life does sometimes. It hands you situations you never expected, people you never thought could hurt you, and lessons you never imagined you would have to learn. And as I sat alone in my car that night, letting the rain wash away the remnants of shock, I whispered to myself, I will not let this break me. I will face this, one quiet step at a time. The betrayal I felt from Sanaa, my daughter-in-law, was sharp and sudden, yet it was only the first chapter of a story that had been quietly unfolding for months. And as I prepared myself to face the days ahead, I understood that love, even when wounded, does not disappear. It endures, silently, patiently, waiting for clarity, understanding, or perhaps forgiveness. That night, I went to bed with a heart heavy but awake. Awake to the reality of change. Awake to the subtle ways family can shift. Awake to the truth that even those we welcome most warmly can sometimes bring us the deepest hurt. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I realized one more thing. The story was far from over. I want you to understand my family, because that's where this story truly begins. It's not just about the betrayal. It's about the lives that intertwined, the love that existed, and the quiet expectations that built a life together. My name is Amna, and I've spent most of my life caring for my family. My husband passed away years ago, leaving me with our son, Saad. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful and kind, someone who always noticed the smallest details. When he was little, he used to follow me around the house, asking questions about the world, about people, about life. I loved those questions, and I always tried to answer honestly. Saad grew up gentle, respectful, and with a strong sense of responsibility. He was the kind of son every mother dreams of. He helped with household chores, studied diligently, and never let me feel alone, even after his father's passing. Our home was small, but it was filled with love. We had a routine: morning tea together, small walks in the evenings, quiet dinners where we shared our thoughts. Those moments became the foundation of our bond. And over the years I learned that it wasn't just about parenting, it was about being present, being patient, and showing care in the simplest ways. When Saad told me he was going to marry Sanaa, I was naturally curious, as any mother would be. I had met her only a few times before the engagement, but she had impressed me with her soft manners and polite speech. She smiled easily, spoke respectfully, and seemed genuinely interested in my son's happiness. I thought, perhaps for the first time, that my son had found someone who could be both a companion and a partner, someone who could share the quiet joys of life with him. First, Sana and I got along well. She asked me questions about Saad's childhood, about my routines, even about my cooking. She seemed to enjoy being around the house, sometimes helping with small chores, asking for advice, and even laughing at my silly jokes. I remember thinking, she's kind. She's gentle. Maybe she truly belongs here. For a while, everything seemed perfect. I tried to give her space, not to overstep, but also wanted her to feel like she was part of our family. I wanted to trust her. But small signs of tension began to appear, almost imperceptibly at first. Perhaps it was the way she would glance at me when I spoke, or the subtle changes in her tone when discussing household matters. I remember once, while preparing dinner, she said softly, "I think we should try cooking differently, maybe make things lighter." I nodded, smiled, and tried not to take offense. After all, I thought maybe she just has her own ways. A mother-in-law should be adaptable, right? I tried to adjust, even encouraged her ideas, hoping we could create harmony. Saad, of course, noticed some of these small tensions too. He would sometimes glance between us, a hint of worry in his eyes, but he never wanted to intervene. He believed, as I did, that family life required patience, understanding, and a gentle approach. And for months, that's exactly what we did. We tolerated small disagreements, brushed off minor comments, and focused on the love that had always held our family together. Home life had its routines too. Our little living room, with its worn sofa and family photos on the walls, was where we spent most evenings together. Saad would sit beside me, sometimes holding my hand, sometimes just quietly reading. The kitchen was my sanctuary, where I spent hours preparing meals that my son loved. Evenings were for quiet conversations, sharing the small joys and sorrows of daily life. And during this time I thought everything was fine. I thought love and respect were enough to maintain harmony. But slowly those subtle tensions grew. Small things that once seemed insignificant began to accumulate, creating a quiet unease. Sana's comments about the house, the way she would occasionally redirect Saad's attention away from me, the polite dismissals that stung more than words could express, all of it started to shift the balance. I remember noticing it first during a dinner, when she suggested that some of my cooking habits were outdated. I tried to laugh it off, offering a smile and a nod, but inside a quiet hurt grew. I didn't understand how someone I had welcomed could question my life in such a gentle but firm way. There were other moments too, like the time she suggested redecorating the living room without consulting me, or when she gently advised Saad to limit my visits. Each of these moments alone seemed small, harmless even, but together, they formed a pattern that left me feeling displaced in my own home. It was subtle, quiet, almost invisible. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part. I could not accuse her openly, could not confront her without causing a rift with my son. So I tried to understand, tried to adjust, and told myself, maybe she is just finding her place, maybe this will pass. Saad noticed my unease, of course. On quiet evenings he would ask softly, "Mother, are you okay?" And I would smile, brushing it off because I didn't want to worry him. I told myself that as long as he was happy, I could endure small discomforts. But each smile I offered was like a bandage on a slowly widening wound. I began to feel invisible, not because my son didn't care, but because the woman I had trusted, the woman I had welcomed into my family, had begun to shift the dynamics quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. It was in these months of small, subtle changes that the foundation for betrayal began to form. I had always believed that family was a sanctuary, a place where love and care would protect us from the harshness of the world. But now I realized that even within these walls, even within this home built with love, cracks could form. And these cracks, invisible to anyone outside, could eventually lead to fractures that no one could ignore. I remember one afternoon when I was folding laundry in the bedroom, Sana entered quietly. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She said softly, almost casually, I think it's better if I manage some things myself now." I froze for a moment, unsure what she meant. Saad was not in the room, and yet, her words hung heavily in the air. I nodded slowly, saying, "Of course, if that's what you prefer." But inside, a quiet storm of hurt and confusion brewed. How had this woman, who once seemed so gentle, come to suggest that my presence, was no longer needed? These moments, though small and subtle, were pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet fully understand. Each one built upon the last, creating a sense of unease that I could not shake. And as I sat quietly that evening, looking at Saad as he helped Sana arrange the kitchen, I felt a sense of displacement that went beyond words. It was as if I were watching my own life slip into someone else's hands, powerless to stop it. And yet I tried to be patient. I tried to give space, to step back, to adjust, hoping that love, understanding, and time would heal the quiet tensions. But deep down I knew that something was changing, a subtle, almost invisible shift that would eventually bring us to a confrontation I never expected. A moment where the quiet unease would erupt, and the betrayal I had begun to sense would reveal itself fully. Because in every family, even those bound by love, change is inevitable. And sometimes those changes come from the people we welcome into our hearts, people we trust, people we believe will love and protect the family as much as we do. I had welcomed Sana with love, with trust, and with hope. But little did I know that this Trevin, the gentlest ripples, can turn into waves if left unchecked. That's what I began to feel in those months after Sana subtly began asserting herself in our home. What once were small, almost harmless comments began to shape the way our family moved, spoke, and even breathed. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, like a shadow stretching across a room, and yet I could feel it. Every glance, every whisper of a suggestion, every polite correction added weight to a growing tension I couldn't ignore. Started with small things. I would prepare a meal the way I had always done. My recipes, my style, the comfort food that Saad had loved since childhood. And Sana would gently step in, suggesting a small tweak. "Maybe we can reduce the oil," she would say softly, or, "let's try adding something lighter this time." I would smile and nod, adjusting quietly, telling myself that she meant well. But then the comments became more pointed. "I think we could try a different arrangement for the living room," she said one afternoon, gesturing at the photos on the wall. "It would make the space feel more modern." At first I laughed softly, thinking it harmless. But a quiet discomfort began to grow inside me. This was my home, these were my memories, and yet I felt like an observer, watching as someone else reorganized my life quietly and steadily. Saad, as always, tried to stay in the middle. He would glance at me apologetically, then at Sana, caught between the two people he loved most. I wanted to tell him to stand up for me, to speak for me, but I knew he was trapped in his own silent struggle. I didn't want to push him further away. One evening we were sitting together after dinner. The air was heavy with silence, a quiet tension I could not name. Sana spoke first, softly, almost conversationally. "Mother," she said, "I was thinking, maybe it would be better if you didn't come over as often. Saad and we want to have more time alone." Froze. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. My hands clenched in my lap. And yet I smiled. I forced myself to smile, because I knew that losing my temper or crying would accomplish nothing. "Of course," I said quietly. "I only come because I want to see my son, but I understand." Saad looked down, his hands twisting nervously. "Mother," he began, but Sana shook her head gently. "No, it's fine. I just think some boundaries would be nice," she said, her voice calm but firm. And in that moment, I understood that I was no longer a part of their private space. My presence, once welcome, was now considered an intrusion. I had been slowly edged out, gently and almost invisibly, until I was standing on the outside, wondering how it had happened. The days that followed were harder. Every visit, every interaction, carried the weight of unspoken tension. I tried to maintain my warmth, my patience, my calm, but the quiet comments, the polite corrections, and the subtle exclusions began to wear at me. I would cook meals, only to have Sana suggest small changes, as if my way was insufficient. I would ask Saad about his day, only to have her redirect the conversation. I began to feel like I no longer belonged in my own home. I remember one afternoon vividly. I had prepared Saad's favorite biryani, carefully marinating the meat, roasting the spices, and cooking it slowly to bring out the flavors I knew he loved. When I placed the dish on the table, Sana glanced at it, smiled politely and said, "It looks good, mother, but maybe next time we can try it with less spice. I think Saad might prefer it milder now." I smiled, but inside a storm raged. "Of course," I said softly, putting on a calm tone. Saad looked at me with a hint of guilt in his eyes, but he said nothing. That evening I felt a quiet ache in my chest, a sense that my role as a mother, a caregiver, and a source of love was slowly being replaced. It wasn't just the kitchen either. Sana began subtly changing the routines of our household. She would suggest rearranging furniture, setting new rules about visiting hours, and even giving advice on how Saad should spend his evenings. Each change was small, polite, and reasonable on its own. But together, they formed a pattern that left me feeling invisible, unimportant, and excluded from the life I had built with my son. And yet I tried to forgive. I reminded myself that she was young, still finding her place in the family, and perhaps she didn't realize the impact of her words. I told myself to be patient, to understand, to let love guide my response. But love, I realized, does not shield you from hurt. It does not protect you from betrayal. The real conflict began when Saad and I had a conversation about it, quietly, one evening after Sana had gone to the bedroom. "Mother, I don't know what to do," he admitted softly, sitting across from me. "I love you, but I can't go against her. I want peace in our home." My heart ached for him. I wanted to tell him to stand up, to defend our bond, but I understood his position too. "I know, Saad," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm. "I only want what's best for you. I don't want to create conflict between you and your wife." And that's when the guilt started to creep in, not for myself but for him. He was torn, trapped between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife. And in that struggle I realized even love has limits. People make choices, sometimes quietly, sometimes unconsciously, that hurt those they care about most. The days turned into weeks. The subtle tensions became more visible. Sana would call Saad to discuss household matters privately, often in front of me, while I tried to sit quietly, invisible. She would suggest plans for their weekends, deliberately excluding me, even though I had always been part of family outings. The polite comments, the quiet suggestions, and the calm assertiveness, all of it became a pattern that left me feeling as though I was being replaced, gently, quietly, and without confrontation. I remember one evening in particular. Saad and I were sitting in the living room, the rain pattering softly against the window. Sana entered, carrying a tray of tea. She smiled at me, but it was a practiced smile, polite yet distant. "I made some tea for us," she said, placing the tray on the table. "I thought we could have a chat." I nodded, grateful for the gesture, and began to speak. "Sana, I want to say something." I paused, unsure how to express my feelings without sounding hurt or accusing. "I feel a little left out lately. I know you want to build your life with Saad, and I respect that, but sometimes it feels as though my place here is shrinking." Sana's eyes flicked to Saad, then back at me. "Mother," she said softly, "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. But I think it's important for Saad and me to have our own space. You understand, don't you?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Of course," I said quietly. And yet, inside, I felt the sharp sting of betrayal. The calm politeness of her words made the hurt deeper. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't cruel, but the intent was clear. My presence, my love, my years of care, it was being quietly minimized. And Saad, he said nothing. He sat there silently, caught in the middle, his shoulders tense, his eyes avoiding mine. I wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, to reassure him, but I could feel the distance growing. The love we shared was still there, yes, but it was being tested by the subtle manipulations, the quiet assertions, and the calm determination of someone who wanted to replace me. It was during these weeks that I began to notice small, almost invisible betrayals. Notes left by Sanaa suggesting changes in routines, subtle instructions to Saad to limit my visits, little comments about my habits and lifestyle. Each one alone seemed harmless, even thoughtful in intention. But together, they formed a pattern that left me feeling pushed aside, replaced, and unvalued in the very home I had nurtured. The pain was quiet, but relentless. I found myself waking at night, thinking about what had changed. Had I done something wrong? Had I failed to love in the right way? Or was it simply that people, even those we trust the most, can sometimes act in ways that hurt us without realizing it, or perhaps with full awareness? And yet, despite the growing tension, I held on to hope. I told myself that family love, the bond between mother and son, could withstand subtle betrayals. I tried to reach out, to communicate, to find moments of connection amidst the quiet storm. But the more I tried, the more I realized that some bridges, once quietly burned, are difficult to rebuild. The rising conflict reached its peak one afternoon, when Saad returned from work, and I had come over, as I usually did. Sanaa was there, arranging some new furniture she had suggested, her smile polite, her tone calm. "Mother," she said softly, "I think it's better if you don't come here so often. We need our time alone." I smiled, holding back tears. "Of course," I said quietly. "I just want to see my son." Saad looked down. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the silent struggle, and I understood fully for the first time that my place in their life was being quietly replaced. And in that moment I felt the full weight of betrayal, not loud, not dramatic, but calm, subtle, and deeply personal. The days after that conversation felt heavier than ever. Every visit I made to their home now carried a quiet tension, a feeling that I was no longer entirely welcome. I began to notice little changes that I hadn't paid attention to before. The soft clatter of plates as Sanaa rearranged the kitchen to her liking, the way she positioned herself closer to Saad during our meals, the subtle instructions she whispered that I wasn't meant to hear but could sense in the air. I remember one particular morning, arriving at their home to bring Saad his favorite breakfast. I had made it with care, thinking it might brighten his day. But when I entered the kitchen, Sanaa was already there, humming softly, adjusting the counter and moving things around. She smiled at me, but the warmth I had expected was missing. "Good morning, Mother," she said, her tone polite but distant. "I made some changes here. I hope you don't mind." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. "No, of course not," I said softly. My hands shook slightly, but I forced myself to smile. Saad, standing behind her, looked at me with a mixture of apology and discomfort. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, unsure how to mediate. That moment, brief and ordinary to anyone else, felt like a quiet declaration to me. My role in their home was shrinking, and there was little I could do to stop it. The subtle manipulations continued. Sanaa began suggesting minor changes in our routines, seemingly reasonable on the surface. She would propose that I come later in the day, or leave earlier, always framing it as concern for Saad and our comfort. Each suggestion alone could be brushed off. But together they formed a pattern, a careful shaping of the home and life that gradually excluded me from the daily rhythm I had helped build. One afternoon, Saad and I were in the living room, talking quietly, when Sanaa walked in carrying a stack of letters. She handed them to him with a smile. "These came for you," she said softly. But as she left the room, I noticed one of the envelopes had my name on it, a note I had written earlier, asking for a small favor. Saad opened it, glanced at it, and then put it aside. I felt a pang in my chest, an invisible wound. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but the message was clear. My thoughts, my words, my presence were no longer considered important. I tried to maintain my composure. I tried to remind myself that I could not force relationships, that love often required patience and quiet endurance. But the quiet accumulation of these moments began to weigh heavily on me. I felt isolated in my own family, watching as my son, my beloved son, gradually moved closer to someone else, drawn by words, gestures, and subtle manipulations I could barely confront. There were nights when I would lie awake, thinking about all the times I had cared for Saad, all the years of patience, love, and guidance I had poured into him. And I would wonder, how did it come to this? How had someone so new to our family managed to quietly rewrite the dynamics of our home, shifting loyalty and love in ways that left me feeling invisible? I tried to talk to Saad to find moments of connection and understanding. "Son," I would say softly, "I know you love her and I respect your marriage. But sometimes, I feel like I'm losing my place in your life." Saad would look down, silence heavy between us. "Mother, I don't want to hurt you, but I also can't go against Sanaa. She has her ways and I need to respect that. Please understand." I understood, of course. I tried to. But understanding did not ease the ache in my heart. Every smile I forced, every polite nod, every soft word of reassurance was a bandage over a growing wound. And yet, I could not allow myself to give up on the family I had loved so deeply. I had to endure, even if endurance meant silent pain. The conflict intensified during family gatherings. I remember a particular evening when we had a small dinner planned with close relatives. I arrived early, carrying the dishes I had prepared, hoping to contribute and share in the joy. Sanaa, however, had already arranged the table in her own way, coordinating with Saad in a way that made me feel like a guest in my own home. She greeted me politely but without warmth, her actions quietly directing the flow of the evening, subtly shaping the interactions to suit her. As the night progressed, I noticed the small, pointed behaviors that marked the rising conflict. When I tried to share a story about Saad's childhood, Sanaa interrupted gently, suggesting a different anecdote that framed the conversation around her and Saad instead. When I offered to help with serving dessert, she smiled politely and said, "I've got it, Mother. You just relax." The words themselves were harmless. But the effect, they made me feel sidelined, unnecessary, and increasingly irrelevant. Saad, for his part, seemed to shrink into himself. I could see the discomfort in his eyes, the tension in his posture, the conflict between his loyalty to me and his desire to maintain harmony with his wife. I wanted to reach out to hold him close, to remind him of the bond we shared. But I knew that in doing so, I might only create further tension, perhaps even push him closer to her. And so I remained silent, quietly enduring the subtle exclusion, the gentle sidelining, and the growing emotional distance. It was during one of these evenings that I first began to suspect something deeper, a quiet, calculated intent in Sanaa's actions. She wasn't merely adjusting to her new life. She was slowly, methodically, asserting herself as the center of our family, carefully reshaping the home and the relationships to her advantage. Every polite suggestion, every small correction, every gentle instruction contributed to a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. I tried to confide in a friend about the situation. "It's subtle," I said softly, tears welling in my eyes. "She doesn't shout. She doesn't fight. She smiles and speaks kindly. But I feel erased, like I'm fading from their lives, slowly, quietly." My friend nodded, understanding in her gaze, but I knew there was little she could do. This was a conflict rooted in home, in family, in love. And sometimes no one outside can intervene without making things worse. The following week brought another moment of tension. Saad returned from work, tired, expecting a quiet evening at home. I had prepared dinner and brought it over, hoping to share a meal and perhaps reconnect. But when I arrived, Sanaa greeted me with her usual calm politeness and said, "Mother, we thought we'd eat first tonight. You can join us later if you like." I nodded, swallowing the hurt. "Of course," I said quietly. Saad looked at me, his eyes apologetic, but he did not speak. I left, carrying the meal with me, feeling the quiet sting of exclusion, of being pushed further and further away from the home and the life I had nurtured. Days turned into weeks, and the rising conflict became a constant companion. Every visit, every interaction, every shared moment carried the weight of unspoken tension. I began to feel like an observer in my own family, watching as my son's love and attention were slowly redirected, as my place in his life was quietly diminished. The small betrayals, the polite exclusions, the subtle assertions of control, all of it formed a pattern that left me feeling helpless, heartbroken, and increasingly isolated. And yet, despite the growing pain, I held on to hope. I reminded myself that love is patient, that bonds forged over decades are not easily broken, and that sometimes, even the quietest of conflicts can be resolved with time, understanding, and careful dialogue. I tried to reach out to Saad, to connect with him in quiet moments, to share memories and laughter, and to remind him of the bond we shared. But the more I tried, the more I realized that some bridges, once quietly strained, are difficult to rebuild. The rising conflict reached a critical point when I discovered, almost by accident, that Sanaa had been influencing Saad's decisions in ways I had not realized. Small choices, what to eat, where to go, even how to spend his evenings, were now guided by her. I realized, with a heavy heart, that her influence had grown quietly but firmly, reshaping the home and the life we had shared. I felt a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and quiet rage, though I kept it hidden. I could not afford to confront her openly. Not yet. I had to understand, observe, and prepare for what was coming. It was in these moments of quiet reflection that I began to understand the depth of what I was facing. This was no longer a matter of minor disagreements or simple misunderstandings. This was a subtle, methodical displacement, a careful reshaping of relationships and space that left me feeling replaced in my own home. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the turning point, the moment where the betrayal would fully reveal itself, was approaching. I tried to hold on to calm, to patience, and to the love I had always carried for my son. But the quiet tension, the subtle manipulations, and the gentle but persistent exclusions had left a mark that could not be ignored. I began to prepare myself, silently, for the confrontation that I knew was inevitable. Because love, even when tested, endures. But betrayal, quiet, gentle, almost invisible betrayal, demands recognition. And soon I would have to face it fully, with courage, with patience, and with an open heart. The turning point came on a quiet evening, the kind of evening that seems ordinary, almost gentle, until a single moment changes everything. I had come over to their home as I often did, carrying small groceries and hoping for a shared dinner with Saad. The house was calm, the lights soft, and at first glance, everything appeared normal. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension that had been quietly growing for months, now preparing to erupt. I entered the living room, and there they were, Sanaa and Saad, sitting close together on the sofa, their heads bent over a laptop. I assumed it was something simple, perhaps Saad checking work emails or a home purchase plan. But as I approached, the screen caught the reflection of my eyes, and my heart skipped a beat. Sanaa was not merely looking at emails or browsing online shopping. She was quietly reviewing a series of letters and documents that clearly involved me. Notes I had written to Saad, messages I had sent asking for help, and even personal reminders I had placed around the house. She smiled softly as she read, and then, almost casually, she said, "Saad, I think it's time we set some boundaries with your mother. She means well, but sometimes, she oversteps." Froze. My mouth opened, but no sound came. The calm, almost casual tone of her words cut deeper than any shout could have. I felt a cold wave of realization. This was deliberate. This was not minor adjustments or misunderstandings. This was a calculated act to push me out, to make me feel unnecessary, even in my own home. Saad looked down, silent. He didn't protest. He didn't argue. And in that silence, I understood everything I had feared. My son, the boy who had clung to me for comfort, who had always defended me, was now being swayed. He was torn between love for his mother and loyalty to his wife. And at that moment, loyalty to her seemed stronger. I tried to speak, to find words that could bridge the sudden chasm opening between us. "Saad, what are you doing?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling slightly. He looked up, eyes filled with sorrow and confusion. "Mother, it's complicated," he said softly. "Sanaa, she wants things a certain way. I can't go against her. I'm trying, but..." But what? I whispered, feeling the quiet rage rising in me, tempered only by years of patience. Are you really going to let her replace me in your life? After everything we've shared? Saad's shoulders slumped. I don't want to hurt you. But I can't fight her. She's my wife, Mother. She's part of my life now. I have to respect that. The words hit me like a storm breaking over calm waters. My presence, my love, my years of guidance and care. It all felt diminished in a way I could barely comprehend. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand recognition, but instead I sat quietly, letting the wave of betrayal wash over me. And then Sanaa spoke again, her voice calm and almost gentle. Mother, I'm not saying you're not important, but we need to have our own life, our own space. You understand, don't you? Understood all too well. She wasn't asking. She was asserting. She was quietly taking over, claiming influence, and shaping my son's life without confrontation, without argument, without even a hint of acknowledgement for the years I had given. I left that evening with my heart heavy, the walk back to my car filled with silent tears. I felt the betrayal like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I had never imagined that someone I welcomed into my family, someone I had treated with warmth and care, could orchestrate such a subtle, quiet displacement. Over the next days, the signs became impossible to ignore. Sanaa began sending Saad messages asking him to limit my visits. She suggested changes to the household budget, subtly implying that I was interfering. She would organize dinners, outings, and even small errands, always leaving me out, always ensuring that her influence was central. Each act, polite and soft-spoken, chipped away at the bond one had thought unbreakable. Saad, caught in the middle, grew quieter. He would glance at me, his eyes full of apology, but his actions were guided by Sanaa's influence. I began to realize that the quiet betrayal was not just in words, but in deeds. The small, subtle exclusions, the decisions made without consultation, the gentle steering of my son away from me. The final blow came unexpectedly. One afternoon I visited the house as I often did, to drop off some snacks Saad loved. When I arrived, the door was closed. I knocked, and Sanaa opened it, smiling as if nothing were wrong. Mother, she said politely, I'm sorry but Saad and I are busy today. Maybe another time. Froze. My hand still on the doorknob. I felt the truth settle like a stone in my heart. I had become an outsider. The woman I had welcomed, the woman I had trusted, had successfully pushed me to the margins. I wanted to protest, to demand acknowledgement, to remind them both of the years of love and care I had poured into our lives. But I realized that confrontation would only deepen the rift. I left quietly, walking down the street with my head bowed, tears streaming freely now. I thought about my son, the boy I had raised, and wondered when the gentle bond we shared had begun to weaken. I thought about Sanaa, the polite, soft-spoken woman who had slowly, methodically claimed influence over my son's life. And I thought about myself standing outside, feeling replaced, unseen, and betrayed. That night at home I sat by the window, watching the rain blur the world outside. I reflected on all the subtle signs I had ignored, the small actions I had dismissed, the polite comments I had brushed off. Each one had been a thread in a tapestry I had not noticed, a tapestry that now revealed the full picture. I was being replaced in my own family. And yet, even in the depths of heartbreak, I felt a quiet strength rising. I realized that while betrayal can wound, it does not define me. My love for my son, my patience, and my dignity remained intact. I could not control Sanaa's actions, nor could I force Saad to resist her influence. But I could choose how to respond, how to endure, and how to find clarity in the midst of this pain. The turning point had come, undeniable and irreversible. The quiet tension had erupted into visible betrayal, leaving me standing outside the life I had nurtured. I felt the full weight of displacement, the sharp sting of exclusion, and the ache of watching my son slowly drift away under the gentle guidance of someone I had trusted. But even in that pain, I began to see a path forward. I would not allow heartbreak to consume me. I would observe, reflect, and prepare. Because sometimes the greatest strength lies in endurance, in quiet patience, and in the ability to face betrayal with dignity, even when it hurts more than words can express. I spent the next days in quiet reflection, processing the magnitude of what had happened. I wrote in my journal, recording my feelings, my observations, and the moments that had led to this turning point. Each entry was a reminder. Love does not vanish because of betrayal, and family bonds, while tested, can endure if we approach them with clarity and calm. And slowly, amidst the tears and sorrow, I began to plan my next steps, not with anger but with purpose. I knew that reconciliation, understanding, or at the very least, acceptance, would require patience, observation, and careful action. The turning point had arrived. The betrayal was clear. And now I had to decide how to respond, how to navigate the complex emotions, and how to find a way forward for myself, for Saad, and for the family I still loved. Because betrayal, while painful, is also a lesson. It exposes the cracks we may have ignored, the truths we may have overlooked, and the reality that love, patience, and dignity must sometimes be wielded with quiet courage. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the days ahead would test me more than ever. But I also knew that I had the strength to face them, step by step, with an open heart and a calm mind. The days after the turning point were quiet, almost painfully so. The house that had once been full of warmth and laughter now felt distant, unfamiliar. I walked through my own home, sitting in the living room, sipping tea slowly, letting the silence stretch around me. I had never felt so displaced, so uncertain, and yet, amidst the sadness, I realized something crucial. I could not allow myself to be consumed by heartbreak. I began to reflect deeply on everything that had happened. The subtle exclusions, the quiet manipulations, the polite assertions of control. For months, I had felt invisible, pushed aside, and replaced in the life of my son. And yet, I realized that the pain I carried was also a form of love. Love for my family, for Saad, and even, in a strange way, for Sanaa. It was the love that made me endure, the love that made me reflect rather than react, the love that kept me patient even when I felt betrayed. One morning I decided to reach out, not to confront, not to accuse, but to understand. I called Saad, asking if I could come over for a quiet chat. When I arrived, he greeted me with a soft, apologetic smile, aware of the unspoken tension between us. We sat together in the living room, the gentle hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence. I took a deep breath and spoke softly. Saad, I began, my voice calm. I want you to know. I understand that life has changed. I understand that you and Sanaa are building your own life together. And I respect that. But I also need you to understand how this has felt for me. He looked down, hands folded, nodding slowly. Mother, I do understand. Really do. I never meant for you to feel replaced. But it's complicated. I love you, but I also have to respect Sanaa's wishes. I want peace in our home. I smiled softly, placing my hand over his. I know, Saad. And I don't blame you. My love for you doesn't mean I can control your choices. I only want to be honest about my feelings, so that we can find a way forward. That conversation was the first small step toward resolution. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was sincere. I realized that resolution doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from calm honesty, patience, and willingness to understand each other's perspectives. Over the next days, I began to observe more closely, not with suspicion but with clarity. I noticed the little ways Saad still cared for me, the moments when he remembered my preferences, the times when he would subtly include me despite Sanaa's influence. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life we once had. But it was enough to remind me that love can endure, even amidst betrayal and change. I also reflected on Sanaa's role. I realized that her actions, while painful to me, were also motivated by her desire to establish her own life with Saad. She wasn't cruel in the traditional sense. She was assertive, perhaps overstepping at times, but her intentions were not entirely selfish. Understanding this didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me see the situation more clearly. People act according to their perspectives, and sometimes those perspectives clash with ours. One afternoon I decided to extend a small olive branch. I invited Sana to tea at my home, just the three of us, hoping to create a space for calm dialogue. When she arrived, her expression was polite, reserved, but not hostile. I smiled softly, gesturing for her to sit. "Sana," I said gently, "I want to say something. I know we've had our differences and I felt hurt at times. But I also know that you love Saad, and that your intentions are good. I don't want to fight with you. I want us to find a way to coexist peacefully, for the sake of our family." Her eyes softened slightly. "Mother, I didn't realize how my actions made you feel. I only wanted to create a life with Saad, but I see now that I may have hurt you. I'm sorry." Hearing those words, simple and sincere, brought a sense of relief I had not expected. It didn't erase the past months of tension, but it created a bridge, an acknowledgement that allowed healing to begin. I nodded, smiling softly. "I forgive you, Sana," I said quietly. "And I hope we can move forward together as a family, respecting each other's space and feelings." From that day, small changes began to occur. Sana became more conscious of my presence, consulting me on household matters occasionally, and Saad made gentle efforts to include me in family routines without conflict. The home still belonged to both Saad and Sana, and that was appropriate. But my place, though quieter than before, was no longer entirely invisible. I also reflected on myself. I realized that resolution is not just about others changing their behavior. It is also about accepting the reality, adjusting expectations, and finding peace within ourselves. I spent time nurturing my own interests, reconnecting with friends, and focusing on small joys that reminded me of who I am outside of my family roles. In those quiet moments, I discovered a subtle strength I hadn't fully recognized before. Betrayal had shaken me, yes, but it had also taught me patience, resilience, and the importance of calm reflection. I understood that life is rarely perfect, and that relationships require continuous effort, empathy, and understanding. I began to document my experiences, writing in a journal about my feelings, the events that had unfolded, and the lessons I had learned. Each entry was a small step toward clarity, helping me process the pain and recognize the moments of love and kindness that still existed. One evening, as Saad and Sana were preparing dinner together, I watched from the kitchen, quietly helping with small tasks. There was no tension in the air, no sharp words or subtle exclusions. The space between us was still delicate, but it was no longer fraught with hurt. I realized that resolution doesn't always mean returning to what once was. Sometimes it means creating a new normal, a balance that honors everyone's feelings while maintaining dignity, love, and mutual respect. I also spent time reflecting on Saad's role. I understood that he had been caught in a difficult position, trying to balance love for his mother and loyalty to his wife. I chose to let go of resentment, realizing that blaming him would only deepen the pain. Instead, I focused on communicating calmly, finding moments of connection, and appreciating the subtle ways he still cared for me despite the shifts in our family dynamics. Over time, the emotional distance began to shrink. Small gestures, a cup of tea offered, a smile shared, a conversation about the day, reminded me that love endures even amidst challenges. Sana and I began to share quiet conversations, discovering mutual respect and understanding. We were not friends in the traditional sense, but we were co-parents in the emotional sense, navigating the complex terrain of family life with care and empathy. The resolution was not instantaneous. It required patience, reflection, and the willingness to accept reality without clinging to anger or resentment. But gradually, I felt a sense of peace returning, a quiet, steady understanding that while betrayal had occurred, love and patience could create space for healing. I learned that families are complex, shaped by personalities, intentions, and circumstances. Sometimes love and loyalty are tested in ways we cannot predict. And sometimes people we trust may act in ways that hurt us deeply, not out of malice, but out of their own needs and desires. Recognizing this truth allowed me to let go of bitterness and embrace a more balanced perspective. By focusing on calm communication, patient observation, and gentle inclusion, I found a way to coexist with Sanaa while maintaining my bond with Saad. The home was no longer the exact place it had once been, but it had become a space where understanding, empathy, and quiet love could thrive again. And as I reflected on the resolution, I realized something essential. The greatest strength lies not in avoiding pain, but in facing it with courage, patience, and grace. Betrayal may wound, but it also teaches. It reveals the depth of our love, the resilience of our hearts, and the importance of understanding before judgment. I began to approach each day with this mindset. Even when moments of hurt or subtle tension arose, I reminded myself that calm reflection and empathy could restore balance. I focused on nurturing my relationship with Saad, appreciating the moments of connection, and allowing Sanaa to settle into her own role without conflict. In this process, I discovered a profound truth. Resolution is not about erasing the past, but about creating a future where love, respect, and understanding can coexist. And in this quiet, steady approach, I found a sense of peace that had been missing for months. Time has a gentle way of settling even the heaviest emotions. It does not erase pain, but it softens its sharp edges. As weeks slowly turned into months, I began to feel that softness return to my heart. The betrayal I once carried so heavily no longer pressed on my chest every morning. Still existed, yes, but it no longer defined my days. Instead, I learned how to carry it with grace. I stopped expecting life to return to the way it was before. That was one of the hardest lessons to accept. Families change. Roles shift. Love grows in different directions. Once I allowed myself to accept that truth, I felt something loosen inside me. I no longer waited for Saad to need me in the same way he once did. I learned to appreciate the ways he still cared, even if they looked different now. Sometimes Saad would call just to ask how my day had been. Sometimes he would stop by with a small bag of groceries, pretending he was only passing through. And sometimes he would simply sit with me in silence, the way he used to when he was a boy. Those moments reminded me that love does not disappear. It simply changes its form. Sanaa, too, changed in her own quiet way. She became more aware, more careful with her words. She no longer spoke over me or dismissed my presence. She still had her boundaries, and I respected them. But she also made room for me, slowly and sincerely. Sometimes she would ask for my advice. Sometimes she would sit beside me in the kitchen, listening as I shared a memory from Saad's childhood. We were not close in the way I once imagined a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law might be. But we were respectful. And sometimes respect is the foundation that peace is built upon. One afternoon, as we sat together at the family table, I looked around and realized something important. The tension that once filled this space was gone. There was no heaviness in the air. No silent competition. No unspoken resentment. Just three people sharing a quiet meal, each carrying their own thoughts, their own emotions, but choosing calm over conflict. That was when I understood that healing does not always come with apologies or grand gestures. Sometimes healing comes through consistency, through changed behavior, through quiet effort, through time. I also learned something deeply personal during this journey. I learned that my worth is not defined by how needed I am. For many years, my identity was tied to being a mother, a caregiver, the center of my son's world. Letting go of that role was painful. But in that letting go, I found something new, myself. I began spending more time on things I had once set aside. I reconnected with old friends. I took long walks in the evening. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world move without rushing me along. I discovered peace in my own company, and that peace became my strength. There were moments when sadness returned, quietly and unexpectedly. Memory, photo, familiar sound. In those moments, I allowed myself to feel without judgment. I no longer told myself to be strong all the time. I let the tears come when they needed to, and then I let them go. One evening, Saad said something that stayed with me. We were sitting together, the house quiet, when he looked at me and said, "Mother, I hope you know, I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to balance everything." I smiled at him then, not with pain but with understanding. I know, Sod, I said. Life asks us to grow in ways we don't expect. That was the moment I knew I had truly healed. Not because the past no longer hurt, but because it no longer controlled me. I used to think betrayal was always loud, angry, cruel. But now I know better. Some betrayals come quietly. They arrive wrapped in polite words, calm voices, and gentle distance. And those are often the hardest ones to face. But I also learned that strength does not mean fighting every battle. Sometimes strength means stepping back, observing, reflecting, choosing dignity over confrontation, choosing peace over control. If there is one lesson this experience taught me, it is this: love should never be forced. When we hold on too tightly, we risk losing ourselves. But when we loosen our grip and trust life to unfold, we often find something deeper: acceptance. I no longer expect Sana to be the daughter-in-law I once imagined. I accept her for who she is. I no longer expect Saad to need me in the same way. I love him where he is. And most importantly, I no longer expect myself to disappear for the sake of others. I exist, matter. And my heart, though once wounded, remains full. As I look back now, I do not see this story as one of loss. I see it as a story of growth, of boundaries, of learning when to speak and when to remain silent, of understanding that family is not about ownership, but about coexistence. The betrayal I never expected from my daughter-in-law became the lesson I never knew I needed. Taught me patience, taught me humility, and it taught me the quiet power of letting go. Today, when I sit at the family table, I no longer feel like an outsider. I feel like a woman who knows her place, not because someone gave it to her, but because she claimed it herself. And that, I have learned, is the greatest piece of all.